We are all treading the vanishing road of a song in the air, the vanishing road of the spring flowers and the winter snows, the vanishing roads of the winds and the streams, the vanishing road of beloved faces. Richard Le Gallienne. Welcome to Montreal Street Signs. In Montreal, avenue generally refers to a small, tree-lined, low-traffic street. But created in 1875, Pine Avenue is in fact a major thoroughfare. And you want a fun fact? For all the maples and elms and oaks, not a single pine tree lives on Pine Avenue. Go figure. Plus, this is a street with eclectic points of view. From the various lookout spots on Pine Avenue, one can see the cross on the mountaintop above, the skyscrapers below, and out to the one-of-a-kind structures built for the World's Fair. This is the Art Deco Cormier House, built in 1930. Ernest Cormier was a Montreal architect who not only designed the Université de Montréal's main building, but had a hand in the design of the Supreme Court of Canada in Ottawa. The home he designed and lived in on Pine Avenue was designated an historic property and even appeared on a Canadian stamp in 2011. This was also Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau's last home. I passed Trudeau downtown once and he nodded, so encouraged. I told him about a game I play with my friends. You know it. If you could have any 5 people from history over for dinner, who would you invite? I told the Prime Minister he was on my guest list. And you know what he said? Who else is coming? Born in Scotland in 1796, John Redpath established a successful sugar refinery in Montreal that allowed him to build the remarkable Terrace Bank in 1837 on a 235-acre estate. The mansion was the centerpiece for what became known as the Golden Square Mile, bordered by Pine Avenue on its north side. It was an area of architectural audacity never before seen in Canada. In fact, controllers of the majority of Canadian rail, shipping, timber, mining, fur, and banking consisted of a small group of about 50 men who called the Square Mile home. From 1870 to 1900, 70% of all wealth in Canada was firmly in the hands of this small group. By 1930, following the Great Depression, and with the dawn of the automobile and a demand for more heat-efficient houses, the younger generations of the families that had built these homes left. The golden era was over. To help us understand the type of proportional wealth we're talking about, all the homes you see on this crescent are built on the same location that John Redpath's mansion once stood, all by itself. We discuss famous Montreal ghosts in another episode, but I'm downright giddy to reintroduce my favorite, Simon McTavish. A partner in the Northwest Company, he was one of the country's wealthiest men. In 1803, McTavish began constructing a mansion on Pine Avenue, but he died before it was finished, and it was simply boarded up. For 60 years, it remained vacant, except for McTavish's ghost, often seen dancing on the roof in summer and skiing down the slope in winter. When the empty mansion was finally demolished, its wealth of brass fittings and marble banisters were salvaged and used in the building of new homes. Here's where the legend gets real interesting. You see, every new house with the old McTavish furnishings also became haunted. The McTavish heirs sold off the property in the 1860s, and 2 famous mansions arose in its place: the Lady Meredith House and Ravens Crag. Ravens Crag was constructed for Sir Hugh Allen and completed in 1863. By the time of his death in 1882, Sir Hugh had built the largest private shipping empire in the world and was the wealthiest person in Canada. His son Montague donated the house to the Royal Victoria Hospital after the death of his last remaining child in 1942. Renamed the Allen Memorial Institute, its lavish interior was repurposed as the hospital's psychiatric department. Ravenscrag had a dark period between 1957 and 1964. An unforgivable time, really, when the facility was used to perform drug-induced mind control experiments. Today, the building has an ominous look, as if hobbled by those memories. In the springtime, its slopes become carpeted with bright bluebells. Ironically, a flower that does very well under the cover of darkness. A celebration of towers, stepped windows, and high chimneys, Lady Meredith House was built in 1894 by another member of the Allen family, Isabella. She married Sir Vincent Meredith, the first Canadian-born president of the Bank of Montreal. 50 years later, Lady Meredith donated the house to the Royal Victoria Hospital, and in 1975, it became the McGill Center of Medicine, Ethics, and Law. Originally, this house featured 3 levels of terraces, rose beds, and a kitchen garden. It was declared a National Historic Site in 1990, the same year somebody tried to burn it down, unsuccessfully. Back in the 1600s and 1700s, Montrealers fetched their water from communal wells, public fountains, and directly from the streams and rivers that flowed through the island. In 1819, reacting to health concerns related to population growth, Montreal began to draw water directly from the St. Lawrence River. In 1918, following an outbreak of typhoid fever, the city built its first filtration plant. It may not look like it where you're sitting, but I'm standing over 37 million gallons of water. The McTavish Reservoir, named after my favorite ghost, is an underground water well. It's formed out of natural rock, a bowl of natural rock. Montreal decided to build its reservoir after a devastating fire in 1852. Built at the highest point in the city, it works like a water tower with gravity, causing the water to flow all the way down through the city and into 5,200 kilometers of pipes. Excuse me, complete stranger. We're discussing healthcare today, and I was wondering if you could name for us the oldest hospital in the world.
That's a tough one.
I thought so.
To pronounce. I believe it's the Montreal Hospital in Sri Lanka, built in the 9th century. Can I go now?
No! Percival Molson was the great-great-grandson of brewer John Molson, and his achievements are legendary. At the age of 16, Molson played on the 1897 Stanley Cup-winning Montreal Victorians. In 1901, he was appointed to McGill University's Board of Governors, the youngest person so honored in school history. In 1910, he set the world record in the long jump. When World War I broke out, Captain Molson joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry and sailed to France. In 1916, he was badly wounded in an act of such valor, it earned him the Military Cross. After a year in recovery, Percy returned to the front lines and was killed by a direct hit from a German howitzer. He is buried in France. Completed in 1918 and only because of an endowment left in his will, the McGill Graduate Stadium was renamed the Percival Molson Memorial Stadium after their fallen hero. The McGill football team plays here, as well as the CFL's Montreal Alouettes. The stadium seats 25,000, more than the entire population of Montreal during the War of 1812. The first football game was played in 1874 between McGill and a squad from Harvard. The Americans loved Canadian innovations like tackling and running with the football. So much, in fact, I hear they still use them. By the way, if you're looking for a local hero, Percival Molson's Stanley Cup, World Record, Military Cross, and namesake stadium are pretty good accomplishments for a man who only lived 36 years. You know, take me for instance. I'm older, and of all the things Percy accomplished, I've, none of them. Well, none, no. None. The McIntyre Medical Science Building was built in 1965 and is the central hub of McGill's Faculty of Medicine. Its position on the sloping side of Mount Royal and the requirement for an entrance on both the ground and 6th floors made it the type of challenge that could only result in a striking architectural achievement. The building is named for the Montreal founder of the Canadian Pacific Railway, Duncan McIntyre, whose mansion once stood on that spot. Inside the McIntyre building is the acclaimed Osler Library with its 100,000 titles. The collection is the finest of its kind in Canada. Benefactor Sir William Osler was knighted for writing the major medical textbook of its time and for introducing the then unheard of method of educating interns, having them join doctors on their hospital rounds. Though he taught at Johns Hopkins and Oxford, Osler left his collection to McGill in gratitude for the education and support it gave him early in his career. Montreal's early Scottish immigrants were dedicated to putting their efforts and money where their hearts were. On Pine Avenue alone, the Scots are responsible for founding the Royal Victoria Hospital, the Montreal General Hospital, and all things McGill. The Montreal General was founded in 1819 by 4 graduates of the Edinburgh Medical School. At that time, Montreal had French Catholic hospitals, the Grey Nuns and Hotel Dieu. The house on Craig Street had 24 beds. The next incarnation on Dorchester had 72 beds on 2 floors. In 1924, it moved again to Tupper Street. It wasn't until 1955 that the Montreal General Hospital climbed the mountain to its present location on the north side of Pine Avenue. Louis-Charles Fouché owned a home here in 1820. It was tucked behind some of the city's very first apple orchards. That house and those gardens came down in 1890 to make room for the Royal Victoria Hospital. The Royal Victoria Hospital was established in 1893 by Lords Strathcona and Mount Stephen. They intended the Royal Vic to be, quote, for the use of the sick and ailing without distinction of race or creed, close quote. Opening day, it employed 150 people, including 14 medical doctors. The corner battlement structures and romantic turrets still framed generous sun porches. Inside, the Vic was Montreal's first hospital to isolate patients with disease so as to discourage the spread of infection. Because of the new super hospitals now being built in Montreal, the Royal Vic will be closing down. I'm not sure what's going to be happening to it yet, but I wish it well. Not only was the first kidney transplant in Canada performed in there, but I was also born there in 19 gobbledygook. Today, we're discussing healthcare with Dr. Dwayne Rahal, dental surgeon. Now, before we start talking about the history, I want to know something because of a personal curiosity. The history of needles. I mean, this is brand spanking new. What were they using 300 years ago?
Well, in the 17th century, they started experimenting by administering opium to different animals to try to inject different fluids using the bladder of animals and using the quill of a goose to try to inject it into a local area to create anesthesia. We've come a long way since then.
Oh, my heavens.
Do you want to see that?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're sure you want to handle that?
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks. In fact, oh, look at that.
Be careful with that.
Now, I have to ask, healthcare.
Yes.
The Amerindians, the French, and then the British. What was it like through those 400 years?
The early Amerindians used a combination of religious customs using a medicine man, and they also used plant remedies. Actually, the Amerindians were the ones that Jacques Cartier asked to help him to cure scurvy because most of his crew members was stricken with scurvy as they crossed the Atlantic.
Now, I understand in 1645, somebody special came to town.
So Nurse Jeanne Mance arrived with Paul Chamelée de Maisonneuve to the island of Montreal, where she established the first hospital in Montreal called Hotel Dieu de Montréal. And here we are at the Hotel Dieu, which translated into English means the house of God.
Now, the first medical practitioners, I find this very interesting. They were actually what?
The first practitioners were actually a combined profession of barbers and surgeons, oddly enough, which had for the longest time as a mode of treating people was to bleed people. And all you needed to know is have a knowledge of where to locate the veins in a sharp instrument to bleed you.
Now, how about the history of medical schools on the island?
Well, in 1811, James McGill, who was a fur trader in Montreal, donated a large portion. Be careful, Michael.
It's so interesting.
I know, but I have to stay away from you for a second. And he was a fur trader that donated a large portion of his estate,
yes,
along with 10,000 pounds, to start up a new institution called McGill University.
And the first French?
Was in 1848, University of Montreal opened its doors to the French community.
Okay, and I think our audience will be interested in learning a bit about dentistry in Montreal.
Until the 14th century, they thought cavities were caused by worms in your mouth. And then they used beeswax to actually plug in some of those holes.
Wow.
But eventually, by the 19th century, dentists wasn't really a distinct profession. It was actually the extractions or any kind of treatment was mediated by those physician barbers that we just talked about earlier on. But by the late 1800s, the dental school was established at McGill, and a couple of years later, the one at University of Montreal was set up.
Makes one wonder if they were better barbers or dentists, eh? Now, really intrigued. The first ambulance.
Well, that's an interesting question, because the ambulance was usually, you had to call a funeral director, because most funeral homes had these station wagons that had a stretcher in the back. So they were able to transport people around Montreal. It was only by 1958 that the Montreal police force started to take over that task.
Okay.
And by 1989, Urgence Santé was set up to serve Montreal and Laval.
Now, I understand the future of healthcare in Montreal is all about mega hospitals.
Oh, well, the future is right now, actually, because by 2015, the McGill University Health Center will be opening its doors. And that's made up of a combination of the 5 major hospitals. Michael, be careful. You're making me nervous.
It's mesmerizing.
The
mega hospitals, yes, sorry.
Yeah, the mega hospitals is a combination of 5 major hospitals in Montreal, namely the Montreal General, the Royal Victoria, the Montreal Neurological Institute, the Children's Hospital, and the Montreal Chest Hospital.
Wow.
And as well, by 2019, the Centre Hospitalier Universitaire de Montréal is going to open up its doors by 2019, and that will be a combination of Hôtel Dieu and 2 other hospitals, namely Notre Dame Hospital and St. Luc Hospital.
Okay.
For total costs of $3.3 billion. It's the first of its kind in Canada.
That's interesting. That's wonderful. Listen, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Reha, and I have an important question for you.
Yes.
Does this facility have an emergency room?
Yes, I believe so. Around the corner. Why?
No reason. I'm feeling a little melancholy. The church I was baptized at in Montreal, St. Dominic's, closed down years ago. And now, Royal Vic, where I was born, is getting all boarded up. Little by little, I'm becoming a part of Montreal history myself.
They call that Vox Populi, meaning voice of the people.
Hi, Miss Kaylee.
History teaches us that change, good or bad, is inevitable. Think of it this way. You're not being swept away, you're being swept up with the rest of us.
So, que sera, sera?
Need a hug? Now, go have a piece of fruit.
Thank you, Miss Kaylee. You know, they say Pine Avenue is at the foot of Mount Royal, but it looks about waist high from where I'm standing. But don't worry, the next street is ground level, I promise. Until then, don't look down. Vertigo, vertigo, vertigo! I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Of course, my favorite street is Bernard.
Would probably be Saint Denis Street.
My favorite street is Saint Viateur because you can do everything on it. You don't have to leave it.
It's Saint Laurent because it's just so diverse from north to south.
I like, is it Rue de Notre Dame in Old Town Montreal. I like seeing the old buildings, the cobblestone streets.
Mont Royal. Just a nice street, and I think it's really does justice to Montreal.